operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep behind enemy lines. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who transformed SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into pride of place as Australia's force of choice. In April 2001, the unflagged Togo fishing vessel South Tommy was detected by the Australian Fisheries Patrol vessel Southern Supporter near Heard Island, well inside the Australian exclusive economic zone. It was suspected of poaching the profitable but endangered Patagonian toothfish. Ordered to proceed to Fremantle, South Tommy turned and fled west across the Southern Ocean, shadowed by the unarmed Southern Supporter. The Department of Fisheries promptly combined with Navy and the SAS to mount Special Operation T-Bone, the capture of the South Tommy.
And I remember General Cosgrove saying to me, are you in a position to do anything about this ship? Can you actually capture the ship? And I came back to him and said, yep, it's quite possible, but we'll require the support of the South Africans. And I remember he said to me, well, we don't know anything about South Africa. We don't have any contacts. How will we start? And I said to him, well, we can start with a troop commander who speaks fluent Afrikaans. And I remember he paused at that point and looked at me in disbelief, hardly able to imagine that we would have an SAS troop commander that spoke fluent Afrikaans.
Within 24 hours, I'd flown out from Australia to South Africa to conduct the planning for the operation to actually board the South Tommy when it passed the Cape of Good Hope. There was some conjecture by the South Africans that we weren't going to be capable of doing the operation. We told them that we were just Australian Navy clearance divers, or even just Australian Navy, so they had no idea that we were Australian Special Forces or Australian SAS. And at one point during the planning stages, one of the senior officers started making a few jokes in Afrikaans about the fact that he didn't even think that we'd be capable of doing it and it would be better off for the South African Defence Force to do it. I was actually able to then respond to him in Afrikaans. That changed the dynamics completely. And we were able to board the MV South Tommy with two boats supported by the South African ship, the Galashewe, and the South African ship, the Protea.
It was a live boarding, so we carried weapons, and we didn't know what resistance, if any, would occur.
The boarding went without a hitch.
There was no shots fired, obviously, and there was only one weapon seen or confiscated, which was an old shotgun, and probably only to use against sharks that were caught on their long lines. I
went and secured the bridge with one of the teams. We were able to actually catch most of the crew that were actually having lunch at the time, and so they were all very surprised when in stormed a number of guys with guns all dressed in black. They had no idea that they'd actually been partaking in illegal fishing, and it was really the skipper and the ship's master and first mate who knew what they were doing was wrong. The ship's captain had been given very clear instructions from his lawyers not to stop the ship under any circumstance, and certainly not to heave to if he was called upon. We were able to go through all of the faxes that were still on the bridge and translate some of the fax information, which was all in Spanish, just using a Spanish-English dictionary that we actually found on top of the bridge. We had quite a few linguists on board. One guy in particular was an Indonesian linguist, and he was able to speak to the Indonesians, who could also speak to the Koreans, the Russians, the Japanese fishermen that we had on board.
I asked in Indonesian who was the captain, and the Siapa Kaptan, and they instantly, as quick as you like, all pointed to this guy. So obviously we detained him, and we secured the crew and secured the evidence, being the long lines, also all the Patagonia toothfish.
How about that? Hey? What size do you reckon the head's going to burn out there? That is a big fish.
Dead fly.
Patagonian toothfish. There's a big fur on the boat, they were even dogs catching that. Some kind of bloody.
These fishermen, whenever they had to throw anything into the garbage, would literally just walk up topside and throw it over the side of the boat. Everything, every bit of garbage, every bit of effluence, every bit of rubbish, with actually no care at all for the environment. So we cleared out one of the bait holds and the hook holds that we actually then turned into the garbage disposal area right at the back end of the ship. And by the end of the trip, which lasted close to 21 days, over the 4.5 nautical miles, 4,500 nautical miles, all of the crew had actually started throwing all of their garbage into our makeshift garbage bin rather than throwing it over the side into the ocean.
It's one of those transits I'd never want to do again in my life. It was a horrendous transit. All you'd be seeing at point was sky, sea. The waves were that big, or the sea state that large, that the back of the stern of the ship would actually shudder with vibration as it was going over the crest of the wave.
What do you think of the trip so far, mate? Straight hands up. I'll put it up there for the next one. Ready?
Because of the government wanting to leverage as much propaganda for this cause, they requested that the naval captain who was driving the vessel slow the boat down so that we would arrive in the morning of a sunny day so that the media can get their fill of the new prize, being the Southern Tommy. Well, unbeknownst to the naval crew, the boys would, in the middle of the night, crank up the motors and power through so we could A, get there quicker, and also try and avoid the media exposure to us on the day of arrival.
Intercepting illegal fishing vessels wasn't the only place that we could ply our trade. In 2003, the MV Pong Su, which was a Korean vessel, was drug running off the coast of Victoria and was identified in Lorne by the Australian Federal Police as drug smuggling and dropping off drugs along the coastline.
Motor vessel Pong Su, this is Australian warship. I need to make sure all your 30 crew can be seen.
They'd found a body off the coast of Victoria that was related to the boat. The Coast Guard had gone in, or the Navy had tried to stop the vessel. They wouldn't pull over, they wouldn't stop, so they brought us on board. We went out on one of the Navy frigates. We spent about 3 days tracking the Pong Su. We couldn't launch anything at the time because the weather was so rough. It was just, the seas were, even some of the seasoned sailors were thrown up at the time. The intelligence that we had was that worst case scenario, possibly even North Korean Special Forces on board the boat. We were told that they may even have surface-to-air missiles, so no one really wanted to go on the helicopter.
That vessel was pursued up the eastern coast and eventually boarded by an SAS team using the Australian ship HMAS Stuart as the platform, and boarded the MV Pong Su somewhere off the coast of Newcastle.
There they go. So I was in the helicopter assault force, and the other guys were in the boat assault force. In the early hours of the morning, we set up the helicopters and the boats. We got over the deck with the helicopter, roped down onto the main deck, and our team was tasked with securing the bridge. So we went up the external stairs into the bridge, secured the bridge. From there, we continued on and fought through, cleared the whole ship. Surprisingly and funny enough, that all the guys from the boat were sitting there in the mess deck, just waiting. And when we burst in, all dressed in black, with our guns pointed at them, they just weren't even fazed.
The MV Stuart then escorted the Pong Su and the SAS detachment back to Garden Island in Sydney, where the Korean fishermen were then taken into custody along with the ship for some time.
In a pointed censure of North Korea, the Australian government gave the empty Pong Su to the Air Force for target practice. F-111 fighters using laser-guided 2,000-pound bombs sank it off the New South Wales coast. Throughout 2002, American interest in Afghanistan waned, and the search for bin Laden had weakened. President Bush said, "Terror's bigger than one man. Bin Laden has now been marginalised." In March 2002, 3 Squadron SAS replaced 1 squadron in Afghanistan. With the American withdrawal, the Australian government was reluctant to put troops at risk.
When we got over there, it was fairly benign, to be honest. Everyone had fled. The campaign that the US had led in the previous 6 to 8 months had made them scramble for the hills, basically. And now it was starting to get a little bit hotter. Perhaps they were going to come back out again. During our time over there, we did a lot of patrolling, a lot of hard, arduous patrolling in the hills, but we didn't get a lot of action in. It wasn't very unconventional warfare that we were sort of attempting. We weren't being utilised the way we should be. We were held back. We weren't allowed to necessarily be put in harm's way to a great extent. That's changed a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, I think, and that's obvious by what's going on. Getting a high-value target or a HVT and getting a job for going in and doing this hit and grabbing this person, those jobs for us, they didn't happen. And I kind of believe that it's taken this last 5 or 6 years for the government to become operationally mature.
However, the Australian resolve to fight terrorism was strengthened in October 2002 when almost 90 Australians were killed on the Indonesian island of Bali when terrorist jihadists bombed a popular tourist nightclub. The atrocity led Australia to consider using preemptive strikes.
I don't think we can rule out preemptive strike as a necessary part of just war theory these days. With weapons of mass destruction, with militarisation, it may well be necessary to go and target a terrorist training camp or preparation area inside a sovereign country. And personally, I believe that in our region, most sovereign countries would probably be very happy for that, although they would object at the time, because we know them to have moderate governments.
Throughout 2002, President Bush vilified Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Bush claimed he was hiding nuclear, chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction, a threat to world peace, and was aiding Al-Qaeda. Bush argued that Al-Qaeda could attack the vital Iraqi oil supply to the US. Bush, denouncing Iraq, Iran and North Korea as a terrorist axis of evil, gave Saddam an ultimatum. Permit United Nations inspectors to search Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, or suffer invasion by coalition forces poised on the Iraqi border. Under threat of immediate invasion, Saddam grudgingly gave in.
I was involved in the weapons inspection tours to Iraq. I was on what they call UNSCOM 63, which is a United Nations Special Commission Iraq in order to ascertain Iraq's WMD program. UNSCOM 63 at the time was the biggest weapons inspection visit to Iraq post that first Gulf War. There was a lot of evidence that they did have a WMD program, but in essence we didn't find anything.
Saddam so restricted the weapons inspectors that Bush lost all patience. He gave Saddam Hussein and his sons 48 hours to leave Iraq. 1 Squadron SAS joined US and British Special Forces as the spearhead of the coalition armies mustered on the Iraqi border, ready to invade.
Silence from Baghdad, expiration of the ultimatum, and in the middle of the night our SAS crossed the border and start to drive inland to the areas where they knew was the sort of line beyond which Saddam's missiles would have range.
We drove all night pretty much to get into our start position, which was deep inside. It was actually the centre area of operations of the Western Desert, a bit over 100 guys. 20 plus vehicles. We also had another troop that did an airborne insertion using American CH-47s. Our role was to basically protect the regional neighbours from Scud missiles being launched in the Western Desert. You know, if you can work out the range of the Scud missile, where it can position itself so that it can reach other regional countries. So our role was to go in there to make sure that none of those missiles were able to be fired at those regional countries and therefore inflaming the entire conflict. The last thing that we wanted was a regional fight.
The Australian SAS and also British SAS and American Special Forces were inserted into what we call that Scud basket.
If one of those missiles had fired, essentially we had failed the mission. So we had quite a bit of pressure on us.
The mobile Iraqi Scud launchers proved elusive.
On one particular night, we were patrolling and it was pitch black. We saw a large missile go off. It had to be close. It was probably only 1 or 2 kilometres away from our position. And a massive flame and flash in the sky and a massive trail. We got on the radio and scrambled a jet. As it turned out, the jet couldn't find the launched missile.
The other organisation from Special Forces which was involved in Iraq was what's known as Delta Force from the US Special Forces, and this organisation had a very important role of hunting for weapons of mass destruction, clearly another politically, strategically critical task. So they were essentially all over Iraq fulfilling this role, and of course we all know that they never found anything. Elsewhere, of course, the Americans to the north, Special Forces Group 10 actually were involved in keeping the Kurds from running amok to the north, and that again was politically important, or strategically important, because if the Kurds had done that, then Turkey clearly would have got upset about it. The Kurds had historical designs on parts of northern Iraq. It also was strategically important. That's an example of how Special Forces should be used, I suppose. In the south, the Americans, the SEALs in particular, their main purpose was to ensure that there was no sort of environmental catastrophic event. In other words, if the oil had been blown, the oil platforms and so forth, by the Iraqis in retaliation to any sort of invasion, and emptied into the Gulf, that would have been a major environmental disaster. And again, potentially the political and strategic support that the coalition was seeking might have rapidly sort of diminished. So the Special Forces had very important roles, typical of what their role should be, in other words, strategic roles.
One squadron quickly covered vast areas of the Iraqi Western Desert.
So to make sure that we didn't have a blue on blue, we had a kill box system which was a gridded map from a pilot's point of view, so he couldn't target anything that was in those boxes. Anything outside of those boxes were active.
Scud communication stations were a priority target.
The first major installation that we came across, we observed during the day, surrounded by the Iraqi army. And I was frankly amazed that we weren't in a firefight during the day. But we got into a position where we observed a significant compound.
It had a huge relay antenna, basically. That was the big focus for us. We were suppressing where their positions were, which is putting in fire onto their positions so that the other teams could go through and clear it. We'd sort of change our fire and move it left so as to not have friendly fire, blue on blue. We basically set up charges on this antenna relay and then blew that to disrupt the communications in the Western Desert. My most enjoyable contact was about 3 days later. We'd seen 6 SUVs sort of pull up and we go, oh, what's going on here? So there's 6 of them and 6 of us. So we're going, surely they're not serious. And then sure enough, rounds start skipping around, we go, it's on. And then we're into a firefight. It was very polite of them to stop and let us know that's what they were planning. I'm on the 50 cal. One of my friends was saying, yeah, Newt's 4 fingers right, 4 fingers right. And I'm laughing because that particular individual missing a finger, so he only had 4 fingers to sort of give me directions. halfway through the contact, my driver was down there and I'm sort of going, yeah, times like this I really wish I'd listened to my father. He goes, why is that? What did he say? And I went, I don't know, I wasn't listening. And he just started laughing, and from there it's sort of, yep, straight into contact. And we've got 50 cals and 40mm grenades basically firing out to them, and our weapons had a better range and we were more accurate, so it was sort of, it was slightly unfair, but they had lots of fun going against us, and we were sort of enjoying a little bit of a esprit de corps contact, because here we are, B troop in the desert in vehicles, and we're a water operator troop in a good contact. And it started coming to a point where we were starting to receive good fire from them, and that's when we decided that we were going to deploy the Javelin, which is a rather effective missile. For me, it was like a video game. So I locked on the third vehicle, fired it off. It's a fire and forget missile. It's going to keep following the vehicle. I've run like hell back to the car. Halfway back, I can hear the troop, or the patrol basically, stop and started cheering and laughing. Quick look back, and the car was on fire, and this missile had kept tracking it and gone through the rear window on the car.
It basically vaporised all the people within inside. The only thing that we found post the contact was the small bone from one of the individual's elbows.
The vehicle, it had sniper rifles, it had NVGs, it had 5 AKs, it really had a lot of equipment that wasn't typical of the normal soldier. I believe that the group we were fighting against were the Royal Guard or the counter Special Forces patrols.
C Troop was able to cross over the main supply route and push north and then head back towards Euphrates River, and they were north of the main supply route. B Troop and the headquarters was able to concentrate on the southern side of the main supply route, which was the main route in and out of Iraq into Jordan. So it was quite a significant area for military traffic, but also a lot of refugees and people trying to escape the bombing that was occurring in Baghdad. And so what you saw was C Troop and B Troop in constant contact with the Iraqi army, moving as the Hammer back towards A Troop, which was the Anvil, all the time looking for those Scud missile launches.
One beside.
There was a lot of traffic on the main supply route. There was a lot of buses of fighting-aged men coming into Iraq. We turned a lot of those around because we didn't want reinforcements going into the fight into Iraq there. There's a lot of money, potentially weapons, etc. coming out. And again, some of the key Iraqi leadership could also be coming out along that main supply route.
All war finish. Peace for Iraq, so coalition, Salam, and Saddam.
Being a small organisation, we couldn't be on the road all the time, but we would do snap vehicle control points along there.
One of the more enjoyable parts for us was dropping in on the main roads and then setting up our own vehicle checkpoints behind their lines. So we'd stop cars and search cars and send them on their way. And then some of the cars were saying, there's an Iraqi checkpoint down the road, just round the bend. And we'd say, yeah, we know. And they go, oh, okay. The next car that's heading that way, we'd say, look, can you tell the next checkpoint that we're down here? I don't think they realise we're down here. They go, oh yeah. Oh, is it for you guys? It's, no, it's the Iraqi checkpoint. Can you tell them we're down here? Oh, yes. And they'd go down, and sure enough, one vehicle would come running down and then stop, turn around, run off, and then we'd finish our checkpoint, go up, move off the side, and then move down, and then do the same thing on the other side of them. And the other troops were doing the same sort of thing, so they had no idea where we were or where we were going to turn up. So it was really an effective way of getting inside their decision-making process. So it turns into an interesting mind game against them. And then we'd disappear and not do a checkpoint for a couple of days, and they'd be completely confused. So it's good times.
I would say for the first 10 to 16 days, the operational tempo and combat tempo was significant. Basically, the guys were operating on 1 or 2 hours sleep a night. We dominated the night because of our night vision technology.
Basically, when the word got given a go, within 40 minutes we were across the line and into a contact. There was Iraqi little convoy basically crossing in front of us, and we've gone, right, we'll stop these guys. Got them out, searched them, mended a few of them that were injured, and then told them basically, yep, go home, don't start fighting anymore, which surprised the hell out of them. And then the vehicle at the back was full of weapons, ammunition, explosives, all of the good stuff. We'll put on a strobe and let an aircraft take care of that.
We gave them leaflets, the key themes of, we're Australian soldiers, we're here to overthrow the regime and to get Iraq back on its feet again. And what we wanted them to do was go back to their commanders and say, look, we'd bumped into some Australian soldiers last night. They were very professional, they knew what they were doing. They were very potent on the battlefield. Let's just give up. And so there was that psychological dimension to the whole fight. And every time that we overthrew a command bunker or an Iraqi force that we came up against, we made sure that they understood that they would be defeated at every turn if they came up against us, and to pass that message back to their command to give up.
SAS captured groups of demoralised Iraqi soldiers.
Sitting there talking to them, and we're all guarding them, and one of the guys had come up and has offered him a cigarette, and he started bursting out in tears, and it was like, why is he crying? You got your weapon out, haven't you? Yeah. He thinks you're offering him his last cigarette. He's gone, oh, and then he had to try and explain to him that, no, you're not going to die. Do you want a cigarette? And then he was crying and profusely happy, and basically could have asked him anything, but they didn't have any quality information for us to pass back. Basically took their weapons off them and said, the war's over for you, go home.
Bear in mind, throughout the whole Iraq war, even though we could kill them outright because they're in military uniform, but we didn't want to. We wanted them to capitulate and maintain an army, and then go back to the way they were. The biggest problem is our ROE, or rules of engagement. We like to minimise civilian casualties, and the enemy would use this against us and use it very effectively. If the heat got too high for these groups, they would then move to Bedouin camps and use the Iraqi civilians as shields, and then try and blend in with them. But obviously, better be safe than sorry than take out a civilian.
Again, the SAS-modified Land Rovers proved invaluable.
The vehicles were, without a doubt, the best coalition Special Forces vehicles on the ground. If they broke down, they were very easy to fix. We went through quite a few CV joints, which we dropped in at night using parachute resupply. We did a couple of engine lifts out there. We used the signposts from the main supply route, Highway 1, to create an A-frame, and we took a Royal Australian electrical mechanical engineer, vehicle mechanic out there with us, again, not an SAS guy. The intelligence on what was going on in the rest of the war was very scant. We actually didn't know if we were winning or losing at this point. As we kept pushing, we didn't want to destroy any of the civilian infrastructure, because again, the whole aim of this was to get Iraq back on its feet very quickly as an upstanding member of the global community. An example was the thing that I termed as the Temple of Doom. You could see these great big silos coming out of the desert floor from quite a distance, and that was the Kabisa cement factory. So we did a reconnaissance to seize a couple of Iraqi prisoners, and we used them to gain detailed intelligence on the factory. Those guys indicated that they had a security force there, but it didn't pose a great threat to us.
When the Iraqis twice ignored SAS surrender deadlines, Burns did not resort to ground assault, artillery or airstrikes.
The JTAC that I had in my vehicle was incredible. We came up with a plan of breaking the sound barrier above the two cement silos. He came down and very low, very fast, straight over the cement factory, but didn't break the sound barrier. And he got on the radio and said, "How was that?" And I said, "That was excellent, mate. It was fantastic, but you didn't break the sound barrier." And he was absolutely devastated. And he asked me again if he could have another go. I said, "Sure, have another go." And he come back around, broke the sound barrier right over the Kabisa cement factory, made an amazing impact on the individuals inside the facility when they come running out with their arms up. It was a thunderous crack, and it was done right over the top of the cement conning towers or the cement silos, and all the windows had broken, and you know, actually a lot of cement dust had sort of plumed up around the place as well. We were able to disarm all the guards, went through, and we actually built up a good rapport with the owner of the cement factory. The next major action was the securing of the Al Asad Air Base, which was the largest air base in the Western Desert there. We found a lot of the MiG-25 Foxbat aircraft were interspersed and camouflaged up out of sight. A lot of the gun positions were all manned with munitions all ready to go. It was just lacking the fighters. But it just showed that I think the preliminary psychological operations and really targeting the will of the Iraqi forces worked well, because they didn't want to fight, and by that time they'd started to depart.
It wasn't so much the enemy that we're trying to contain and control. It was more stopping of people either looting ammunition, weapons and so forth, then obviously later to use against us or potentially coalition partners, but also to stop them from harming themselves. There were massive bunkers just exploding because a looter had tripped an IED or a booby trap. And also we wanted a lot of these munitions to be kept for the capitulation or for the Iraqi army post-war.
When the war phase came to an end, they found themselves not just sitting in the desert, but in possession of a major Iraqi Air Force base. And at one stage it was their quiet boast that they had more aeroplanes than the Royal Australian Air Force. The Chief of the Air Force disputes that, I'm sure, but I did visit them at that base and found them in fine fettle.
We were very mindful to make sure that we didn't damage a lot of those aircraft as well, because if Iraq was going to get back on its feet again quickly after we'd removed the regime, you know, we wanted them to have an air force which was capable.
The SAS squadron at Al Asad Air Base was relieved by commandos of the 4th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment. Operation Iraqi Freedom lasted from the 9th of March to the 1st of May 2003. Saddam Hussein was captured, convicted by an Iraqi court, and executed for crimes against humanity.
Iraq was a merger of the black and the green. So the skills and drills that we'd learnt doing domestic counter-terrorism came into play in conjunction with our green skills, our surveillance skills in the Western Desert. Our ability to penetrate into an area discreetly and not being detected, observe, do surveillance and reconnaissance, and then follow through with a direct action in the vehicles, and then to move through a complex urban structure and terrain, brought both the black and the green skills together. And what we started to see there was a merger of, you know, if you like, the grey role, which we then took those lessons from Iraq into our year on counter-terrorism duty.
Some SAS soldiers developed their own professional critique of counter-terrorist strategy.
When the Americans decided to focus on Iraq, I think that was the time that we lost the war, or we lost the momentum, certainly in Afghanistan. Afghanistan 1 was really a special forces war, and it was not a conventional war. The Russians proved that it was a special forces war. When I say the American Special Forces, I'm talking about their Green Berets. Small teams attached to large Afghani organisations that were doing a lot of good work. The entire campaign could have been completed by just those guys alone. When you look at the way the American military is designed, it's big army and it's big army centric. I think politically it's the big army that's got the say, and it's the big army that wants to get into the fight. Once a large amount of conventional forces were brought into Afghanistan, that's when we started seeing the casualties and the friendly casualties. Because the way special forces operate is short, sharp, usually at night, very sort of swift actions based on a lot of intelligence. You contrast that with a large, slow-moving conventional force that drives the same route each time. It moves out of a camp, and I think that's where we lost the ball on Afghanistan.
Ops Scrummage were Defence Forces' response for the Rugby World Cup, and we had forces ready to respond, much like we did for the Commonwealth Games and as well for the Olympic Games. So we had forces that were ready and capable of dealing with domestic counter-terrorist incidents, which we do on a day-by-day basis.
Throughout 2004, the West monitored the spread of Al-Qaeda in many countries. In 2005, for the first time since Vietnam, a new SAS squadron was formed. 4 SAS based at Swan Island near Melbourne focused on strategic intelligence and hostage rescue, particularly in Africa. In 2005, the CIA closed its Bin Laden tracking station, yet Al-Qaeda was surging strongly in Afghanistan, and most of the population was again under Taliban control. So in 2005, coalition forces returned to the fight against terrorism.
Initially was more of a find and engage the enemy in reconnaissance, long-range patrolling with long-range patrol vehicles, motorbikes, essentially to stir up the enemy just to find out where they were. A lot of time spent underneath binoculars and trying to identify the enemy.
At this stage, Uruzgan province seemed very peaceful.
When you read in the Bible about the Garden of Eden and how that's described, you can imagine this harsh desert wasteland and yet these pockets of pristine green manicured grass and apple orchards and fig orchards and other fruit trees, cornfields. And as the ice melts during the year, as it transitions to summer, the water runs down and actually provides a lot of good irrigation and farming land. So some of the green belts in Afghan are quite lush. But as we found out, the reason that it was a dead zone is because this was traditional homeland of the Taliban, and it was actually where a lot of them lived. So we pretty much drove into what you would consider the hornet's nest. And the boys in 2005, when they initially went in there, I believe it was 2 Squadron, had significant battle.
In the early days, 2006, it was very long-range orientated. They would try and shoot mortars at us. Their rudimentary system of firing long-range rockets. When we were close enough, they would try and engage us with machine guns, things that would reach out to us. Again, we had a much higher calibre, better technology, so we could reach into them a lot easier from a longer distance. Towards the end of that tour, it was more about starting to creep into the green, or what we call the green belt, where the enemy locations were, and trying to infiltrate them at night time and pick up certain individuals and parties of the enemy.
There was a few procedures that we'd follow in relation to how we would approach any built-up area or any urban area. You would drive within, maybe 2 kilometres of a village, but in visual range, but out of sort of small arms range. And if it was a Taliban-held area, you'd find out pretty quickly. And they'd send out some RPGs or some machine gun fire, and at that point you realise that it was Taliban-held, and you'd start to react to that. If things went well, you'd obviously move forward, advance, close and kill the enemy.
In 2007, a Special Operations Task Group consisting of an Australian SAS squadron, commandos of the 4th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, and engineers of the Incident Response Regiment were deployed to Tarin Kowt Base in Uruzgan Province, joining with British and Dutch Special Forces to fight Al-Qaeda.
2007 was the first time the dogs were taken on operations over in Afghanistan. We have found that the Belgian Malinois is the dog of choice for us most of the time. They have more stamina, they're a more agile animal over, say, something like a German Shepherd. They will go until they quit, which works for us, and that's what we needed, an animal that will refuse to give up. We had a video camera system that we could attach to their back, And we had a small screen that we could watch so we could see what the dog was seeing. Maintain relative safety from our position, send the dogs out in front to scout ahead to find out if there's any enemy activity, IEDs, enemy equipment, anything else up there in front of us before we would then, push through that dangerous space, that choke point or that building or whatever it was. And it was something that was done under a lot of deliberation. It wasn't just an animal that we just unclip as soon as we hit the ground and just let him go until we pick him up at the other end and he did whatever he wanted.
For a time, the SAS teams could use cultural indicators to identify Taliban leaders.
Initially, one of the weaknesses we sought to exploit was their need for status within their group. So you would have Taliban commanders who would have the best looking weapon. They would carry very specific weapons, AK-74s, which is a 5.56 version of an AK-47 basically. They were quite rare, so you'd find the commanders carrying those kind of guns. They also would always move around in a packet where they had 5 bodyguards, as a show of status as well as protection. And that really played into our hands because we were looking for the commanders. So obviously when you saw these groups of individuals moving around, you could pretty much guarantee that you're on the money, you're on the right track in who you were looking for. We stuck to essentially what we would call the Taliban uniform in the early years. They would typically wear black or white turbans. They would all wear eyeliner, like mascara, which again identified them as Taliban because locals didn't wear that. Farmers and locals in Afghanistan would sort of wear different coloured dish dash and they simply wouldn't have the money or the need to wear the equipment or the jewellery or the watches or just the things that the Taliban used to do. So they used to stand out, but they changed that. They learned that after a couple of years that was allowing us to target them. The only other thing that was a weakness for the Taliban was how they treated their own people. Because the Taliban are not wanted in Afghanistan by the Afghanistan people, no matter where you go. They're traditionally Pashtun, which is a particular tribe, but the way the Taliban ruled Afghanistan when they were in power was by fear and intimidation and under Sharia law. So generally the people, particularly the women in Afghanistan, didn't want them in power. And they tried to stand over the locals. They'd force themselves onto villages and make them supply them with food and let them stay in their houses. Whereas every time we went somewhere, we'd be trying to do the right thing by the community. That gave us a lot of information about what the Taliban were doing and they were happy to approach us about that. Gave us a lot of sources, so that in the end essentially was a weakness for them, the way that they treated their own people.
2008, back into Tarankout. The roles had changed a little bit due to IED threat and we had one KIA, a signaller, Sean McCarthy, at the start of our tour in 2008.
They increased their level and frequency of their IEDs. Their technical knowledge around IEDs improved and a lot of that flowed out of Iraq.
They learned pretty quickly that the only thing that could really affect us was IEDs in the vehicles. When we had to use vehicles, we would push into the Bushmasters due to their higher security and safety.
They started to use EFPs. These are projectiles that are formed from an explosion that are designed to penetrate armour.
Again, 2008 was now the start of more helicopter-based operations as well. So we're getting a lot of support from not only the Australian Chinooks, but also the American helicopter brigade that was based down in Kandahar.
The vehicles we were using were the long-range patrol vehicles. The thing that the vehicles were really good for was literally to live out of and travel long distances. They were reliable. They are a great recon vehicle. As the IED threat grew, people were looking to go away from them just simply because there was no armour protection. But as we found when we hit a number of IEDs throughout those early tours, and the fact that the vehicles were open actually saved lives, because what would happen is the pressure from the blast would be able to escape because there's nothing holding it inside the vehicle on something like a Humvee. And what they were finding was that overpressure in a vehicle like a Humvee was actually killing people. And the other thing was it was throwing men out of the vehicle as opposed to bounce them around inside a vehicle or send shrapnel through them.
Many operations we did in 2008 were nighttime operations. We removed the Taliban leader of Uruzgan at the time, who was Mullah Barry Gul. Now, the effect that had on that battle space was significant. The higher up the Taliban commander, say someone like Mullah Barry Gul, that slowed their operations down for 6+ months. So until the core Taliban, I guess, decided on who was going to come into that area then and take control. again, it was only a matter of time, really, before he either left the country because there was too much pressure on him, we either detained him or he was killed in an operation of some sort. We had travelled up to what's known as Forward Operating Base Anaconda. We went up there, we were chasing a Taliban leader who would come in to take over. The first night we were there, we found out where he was. We conducted a night operation on foot, which ended up being about 12 kilometres walking through the Greenbelt at night to try and find this guy. He'd slipped away from us, but we were still up there with the Americans. So they said they had some trouble to the north, and they said they always get to a certain choke point and they will get attacked. They said it happens like clockwork every time, so they just never had enough people to do anything about it. The Americans had said they had not been able to breach that valley in over 4 or 5 months. So essentially that whole area was enemy-held territory. So we conducted an operation that day to do a very similar type of job, push as far up that valley as we could go. Then they would push through to the north, essentially flushing out any of the enemy straight into the SAS patrols that were hidden up in the rocks in the hills. Another 7 enemy were engaged and killed in that engagement. We were in the American armoured Humvees. As we got into the vehicles and we started to head back down the same valley we came up because it was a one-way valley, there was a lot of talk over the enemy communication systems. They were saying they were going to ambush us. We came over to a small ridgeline where we were initially engaged from 4 different angles from that southern position. Heavy machine gun fire, a lot of RPGs flying past, and then mortar rounds started coming in. So I remember seeing rockets flying past the vehicle, I remember seeing rockets exploding in front of the cars, bits of shrapnel bouncing along the dirt, rounds kicking up around us, and the Americans and the Australians fighting back from the vehicles. I had a 84mm Carl Gustav rocket launcher, so I grabbed that, had a target indication, and started to put rockets back downrange. So the enemy thinks that they've hit a much larger force, or that they don't have the firepower to take us on. Each time that rocket went off, we would get a lot of bullets would come flying back our way. So we became a bit of a target for that short period there. There wasn't any rocks to hide behind, there was no trees, there was nothing. It was really just an open football field, essentially. Whilst doing that, we then were hit from behind. So a burst of gunfire or machine gun fire came right between myself and my patrol member. The cars were rocking around in that space, started to return fire. The Australian Joint Terminal Attack Controller managed to get one of the American jets overhead, who started to put some offensive fires onto those positions on the ridgeline. It was using the chain gun onto the north, and then we ended up using it a little bit later on to drop 500-pounders on what we believe was one of the main positions to the south. And this is the part that we didn't realise at the start was the enemy were well established along that route. And then we started to get hit again with machine gun fire and RPGs. It would start at the front of the packet and 5 cars deep, they would just rake across all vehicles. And I remember once being on the southern side of the car, feeling the bullets coming that close that I could feel the metal flaking off the vehicle as it was hitting the car, right next to my head. I could feel them snapping around the back of my legs, they were chasing you, hitting in between your legs and your feet, etc. Chasing you around the cars. That went on for quite a while.
A wounded Afghan interpreter was falling behind. He faced certain death.
He was lying down, face down, not moving, getting shot at. And I had a quick discussion with my team leader at the back of the vehicle saying I was going to go get him, and he wasn't too keen on that. But I said I was going to go anyway, and I made my dash out there to where he was, and I managed to get him to his feet and get an arm around him, kind of underneath him, and then start to half carry, half drag him as he was kind of walking, running. I got him back to the car eventually while it was still driving away.
For his bravery, Corporal Donaldson earned the Victoria Cross.
2009, back again, the landscape had changed as far as operations went yet again, due to rules relied upon us by ISAF. Nighttime operations were a lot more difficult, so again we had to change the way we did business, and 99% of our operations in 2009 would have been done in the daytime. We had to land on top of them to be able to catch them out. We couldn't walk in without being seen.
Really had to concentrate on what the enemy tactics were at the time, because they evolved just as quickly as we did. And to stay one step ahead of them, we needed to constantly evolve our techniques, sort of talking around every 3 months. That includes how you operate on the ground, how you're actually assaulting the building. You know, do you step through a doorway? They start to put IEDs or pressure plates in the ground on the corner of the building, knowing that we would kneel there. Or they put a pressure plate inside a doorway because they know we step in there. So we had to do what was then called a giant leap. So if you're going to enter a room, you took a very large step and you took it on a diagonal axis so that you would, if there was a pressure plate there, you'd clear it.
Predominantly, 2009 was all helicopter-based operations using American helicopters. Our operations started to become shorter and more time-sensitive, so we were able to react to the enemy a lot quicker. We were able to predetermine where they're going to be and what they were going to do, and then be able to be there before they get there or catch them unawares, and that was a good change for us.
That became a bit of a drama when they realised how we were operating and they started to attack or prepare their positions to deal with the helicopters. So we would then have to do what we call landing on the Y, which means you offset your assault. So you would land the helicopters a significant distance from the building and you'd all have to move in and create a cordon first and then essentially shrink onto the building. That gave the helicopters more protection, but it did allow more time for the enemy to be able to squirt or get out of the target buildings.
In June 2010, in the Shah Wali Kot Valley north of Kandahar, a major battle erupted between a large force of Taliban and Australian Commando and SAS Special Forces backed by Afghan army units.
We located a senior Taliban commander that we'd been looking for around 3 years. A very hard individual to track. He was actually, at that time, inside a compound right on the edge of the tree line of the greenbelt inside the valley. We had a 4-in-2 package, which was 4 Black Hawk helicopters to carry the guys and 2 Apache gunship helicopters to fly and support. Pretty much as soon as those helicopters touched down on the ground, it was as if every peak on the northern side of the valley erupted enemy machine gun fire and it started to sort of pour in on top of them. The guys on the ground started to receive some support from the Apaches, but the problem was the Apaches firing at these machine guns in the high ground weren't having much luck because there was a lot of caves, a lot of big rocks and boulders. So when the Apaches would fire, these guys simply would retreat into the caves, and so the boys on the deck were still basically under constant fire for the whole time. As we came in to land, our helicopter became the focus of the machine guns because obviously to take out a Black Hawk's a big deal. We got off and you could see it, the rounds hitting the ground, and I remember turning around, I was waving to the pilot, like to get out and go. But they were on bingo fuel, so they'd been flying this mission and doing what we'd asked them to do, and he was basically on vapour. But for us, anyway on the valley floor, the decision needed to be made. Do we want to extract? We're outnumbered, we've got 2 guys wounded, our dog's gone down, we've lost the initiative. So the sergeant decided that we would carry on the fight. We weren't going to extract, we were going to move down the creek line, use that as cover. And once we're in the greenbelt, we'd find the first building and we'd assault that building. So the first 2 guys started to punch across and we got hit. They had a PKM on fixed lines, pretty much, straight down the creek line. We'd use the Apaches to just target that one position acutely. We found that problematic because we couldn't see the position, so we couldn't give them an accurate distance. So, they were sort of firing in between us and this position and not actually hitting it.
The SAS team was then exposed to fierce gunfire from the compound.
It was somewhere in the vicinity of between 10 and 20 metres from the enemy position at that point. I just saw an opportunity to go, and I thought I had a pretty good shot. So I went up to the wall, and when I got there, I dropped down onto my knee. That first machine gunner was maybe, sort of 1 to 2 metres to my left-hand side. And as I did that, he turned his head and we sort of looked at each other, and he started to wheel his machine gun out of the wall, and I engaged him with 2 rounds. From that point I got up and started to move again, and the other machine gun, which was still firing, I engaged that until it stopped firing.
Although their target escaped, E Troop killed several important senior Taliban leaders and many of their fighters. Enemy numbers had been much larger than expected.
Obviously what had occurred was the individual we were after was actually the last man to walk into a meeting of senior Taliban commanders for that region, and each one of these commanders sort of had brought a number of fighters with them. And to be fair, the estimates easily would have been 100 insurgents in the valley that day.
Since its modest beginnings, the Special Air Service has been synonymous with a level of professional excellence to which the rest of the Australian Army aspires.
The SAS Regiment and the 2 Commando Regiment were awarded the Battle Honour, Eastern Shah Wali Kot. Corporal Ben Robert Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross.
2011, yet again, the enemy was now starting to adapt to us working in the daytime. So we had to change the way we did things. A lot more aggressive. We were able to pinpoint, surgically strike into areas, get the people that we're after, potentially, and then remove ourselves quickly to be able to reset and potentially do that 2 or 3 times a day, sometimes 4 times a day. So it was a pretty heavy workload in 2011, and from a strategic point of view, it was quite successful.
In April 2010, Osama bin Laden was found living quietly in Abbottabad, North Pakistan. On the 2nd of May, a combined CIA and SEALs team launched from Afghanistan, flew under Pakistani radar and landed in bin Laden's compound. Watched in the White House by video link, they shot bin Laden and several others with him. Many Americans had not forgotten 9/11.
2012, just another extension really of 2011. 100% helicopter-based operations, 100% targeting of the senior leadership in the Taliban.
American Special Forces teams and armed drones were also killing many Taliban commanders. But their Taliban subordinates were increasingly afraid to replace them.
Once removed, their operations just fell apart. And we got that information through intelligence chains that they didn't want to fight anymore. Once their leader was gone.
It was interesting to read the enemy's mail, which we did. As the years went on in the fight, Al-Qaeda was at times likened to women. They couldn't stand and fight. They weren't courageous. They didn't like the accommodations. They felt like they deserved better than sleeping in caves and laying on the rocky hillsides. And there were fractures. There was not complete trust between Al-Qaeda that brought great assets in terms of money, of communications gear and that sort of thing, weaponry. But the human connection was not that good.
Yeah, they used to call us the bearded devils in the early days. And towards the later years also there was intelligence reports that were out stating to avoid us, don't engage with us, avoid doing what you're doing in the area where we were. That's, I guess, a validation enough of how effective we were being at the time. That was backed on top of with commandos conducting operations as well and applying pressure to those areas of large fighters' numbers. They might not have a leader at this stage, but now they're getting followed up with a much larger coalition force to go and put pressure on these guys that are still willing to fight. They just didn't have the command and control to do so.
Throughout the war in Afghanistan, the coalition forces had been training the Afghan Defence Force to replace all foreign troops. By late 2014, most forces of the Coalition of the Willing had withdrawn, and Australia's SAS and commandos had come home. But in 2014, Islamic insurgency again erupted when a new force, IS, Islamic State, routed the Iraqi army and captured much of Syria and northern Iraq. IS, ignoring existing sovereign borders, proclaimed an Islamic caliphate encompassing a vast area of the Middle East and North Africa. When the savagery of IS became known, even Al-Qaeda disowned them. To aid Iraq, the Australian commando elements were sent to help train the Iraqis. SAS would be very suited to fighting Islamic State forces.
SAS is extremely well suited to counterinsurgency operations. Counterinsurgency operations is what's happening now. The strength that SAS has is that it essentially, when you peel back the onion here, SAS itself is about insurgency or counterinsurgency. If I could use the analogy of David and Goliath. Traditionally, SAS has been used, for instance, during the Second World War and during the Iraq War, initially at least, during the takedown of the regime, as the David taking on the Goliath, the small force taking on the large conventional force. Its greatest utility as the David is taking on the other Davids. Now, the other Davids in the modern sense are the insurgents, the terrorists, the guerrillas that we're opposing And SAS, being essentially having the same sort of insurgent skills, knows how to conduct counterinsurgency perhaps better than any other organisation.
In thinking more generally about the SAS, one of the things that occurs to me, they've become so well known, not in particular, not in the detail of their operations, but just their potential and their overall impact on conflict, that there's this sort of popular thought that we should have more of them. And here's the rub. There's not a large pool of people from whom to select. And the thought that you would suddenly double their number would be to dilute the quality of the young people who join the regiment. And we must never do that. And the reason why they're so good is because they are the best of the best, and they're put through very searching selection techniques. Let's have as many as we can get, but never, ever, ever drop the standard. So that, to me, underpins the awe-inspiring results they've continued to achieve.
Some SAS soldiers have fought in Afghanistan 6, 7 or even 8 times.
But there's a penalty that comes with that. The more you're exposed, the higher your chances of becoming a casualty. They go to that well willingly, and we keep sending them to the well. They're probably amongst the most mentally robust people who've pulled on a uniform. But they've got a limit, just like everybody's got a limit. And I think we've got to be particularly conscious that they will carry their own set of scars and stressors into the future, and we have to look after them. I know this won't be a popular message within the regiment because from their point of view, they're doing what they joined the army to do, but we've also got to be a bit of a parent in this regard and say, sometimes we're going to say enough is enough. Take a rest.
When you talk about health post SAS life, every single soldier, officer that's been in the regiment for any period of time will have some sort of physical ailment to various and lesser degrees, because the regiment is extremely hard on the body and on the mind as well. Many of them have died reasonably young in life.
However, many come home to face an even greater battle with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
I've been suffering from PTSD since 2002. I kept it a secret from the Army for, up until now. No one really knows. It's not something you want everyone to know about. You know, the SAS soldier is deemed to be bulletproof, 6 foot tall and hard as nails.
One of the dangers that face a lot of servicemen and women is that the symptoms of PTSD are in fact almost the very same symptoms that you need to be an effective and successful soldier. You need the hyper-alertness, you need the attention of danger.
Loud bangs would scare the hell out of me. I'd sort of almost hit the deck walking through town with my wife and children. I'm very conscious about where I'm going, who I'm going with, not hang around large groups. I wouldn't go shopping with my wife for a long, long time. For some reason I was nervous about everything, and I couldn't understand why. You know, going to a restaurant, for example, and not sitting with my back to the door. I would always put myself in a corner where I could see everybody, and I'd be watching them to see what they're doing.
These are the kinds of safety behaviours that you get locked into, but the irony is that the more you rely on these safety behaviours, the deeper and the stronger the PTSD gets, because you get a sense of relief from engaging in ensuring that the environment is safe, but all that serves to do is to reinforce that there's a real danger there. And it makes everyday life exactly the same as the situation where the trauma happened, and then the PTSD continues.
You know, I'd have extremely bad nightmares about being captured and all that sort of stuff. I didn't really know anything about it until I was told about it from a couple of Vietnam veterans, and they explained that PTSD was something that happens from being shot at too many times,
being involved in bombings, you know, close air support and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, it affects my family a hell of a lot, like losing my temper at the drop of a hat. My kids don't understand why I yell and scream at them for no reason. I don't understand why I do it.
PTSD is an isolating disorder. It's a disorder where your world shrinks down because you try to eliminate the sources of threat so that this mortal threat response doesn't get turned on. So one of the classic things that happen to many people with PTSD is that their world gets smaller and smaller. Their ability to reach out to old mates and old friends gets limited, and often they're the last also to recognise what's happening. It takes an enormous courage to be able to identify that there's something happening with me.
My wife, she recognised it way before I did. I found it hard to communicate with people. I would say, especially with the civilian community, they certainly don't look after each other the way a military person would another military person. Military mates are mates for life, there's no doubt about it.
One of the things that we see time and time again is service men and women coming in with such a sense of shame that they've got injured, that they've got PTSD. There's still so much stigma around this illness. There's no rhyme or reason why one person will get it or another. It can happen to anybody. It's critical that people that develop PTSD are supported by their peers, are supported by their colleagues, are honoured for their work. It's easy to push on and to keep pushing on and to try to ignore it and to try to hope it away. But this illness doesn't hope away.
I see a psychologist regularly, psychiatrist and a psychologist. I would say it has to be helping, especially the medication. If I don't take the medication, if I forget to take it, my wife knows immediately. I start to get frustrated, very easily flustered, bad-tempered, and she knows. She carries the tablets around with me now, with her now, so she'll hand them out to me if I forget to take them.
Once the engine that drives PTSD is gone, then you release so much of yourself back into being able to manage your life. PTSD takes 70% of your energy to be able to manage. When you can shut it down, you've got a lot more resources to be able to deal with the problems of transitioning from a military to a civilian life. But with PTSD on top of that, it's a very hard ask. But it is treatable, it can be shut down, it's not a death sentence, and you don't have to live with it.
On the future security of Australia in its region and the globe, undoubtedly I think fundamentalism, terrorism will continue to be a severe irritant. I don't see fundamentalism overthrowing Western democracies in any sense, but I see it causing a lot of difficulties, as it is doing and has done in Iraq and Afghanistan, and may well do in other places, Iran, elsewhere. But to me, the real global issue of immediate import, and one that will continue to be of huge import, is on the subject of food security.
I'd never really appreciated the impact of illegal fishing in the Southern Oceans until I stepped foot on board the MV South Tomie. It was a purpose-designed fishing factory and a long line fisherman. That is, it would lay a fishing line somewhere up to 1 kilometre in length, lay 4 or 5 of these in a grid pattern, and they'd bait around 50,000 hooks a day to pretty much capture any of the fish that are on the ocean floor in those areas. The lines are picked up from the bow of the ship, the fish are taken off the hooks, they're topped and tailed, gutted and cleaned, and snap frozen immediately. The lines passed out the back of the ship and then rebaited and rehooked and rebaited as required. But with 50,000 hooks a day, it's not hard for your imagination to realise how quickly it will be when all of our fishing stocks will be depleted in that area.
How is this poor old stretched globe going to double its food production by 2050 to meet a population increase from 6 to 9 billion, when our agricultural lands are decreasing by about 1% per year, when the fertility of the soils is rapidly degraded, and when the availability of water to support
current food production plus expanded food production simply is not going to be there because we are running out of water and because we're getting less rainfall in many areas. When you get problems in very large population centres, then you've got the potential of very large movements of disaffected people, civil strife and insurrection, movements of people across borders to where they think their chances of survival are better. So if we don't get on top of food sustainability and really look after the fundamental fertility of our soils and the proper management of the bit of water that does fall on our soil, then we're going to be in big trouble. But I believe in Australia we've got the right answers, and one of my jobs out of military life is now to try and coordinate those responses to lead the way in Australia and then to show the rest of the world that there are answers to the food security issue.
The enterprising versatility of SAS suggests new ways the regiment could be used.
A scenario where the government could make far better use of SAS is clearly in the undeclared war against drugs in Australia, where over 1,000 Australians die each year from heroin overdose. We know that we can do a serious dent in that drug trade. We know that the bulk of those drugs come from the Golden Triangle, where the precursor chemical, acetic anhydride, is moved in drums across the border from Kunming in Western China through to various bush stills in Thailand and Burma and so on. It's put together in these bush stills and then in small packets it's moved out through Hong Kong and down through the Mekong River and out through places like Vietnam and so on. Now, SAS can't operate in some of those areas because it's clearly the job of informants and so on. But back at the source, where the actual opium and acetic anhydride comes together, SAS could have a powerful impact. The SAS could make that factory disappear.
Would the Australian government ever commit SAS to operations in foreign countries uninvited?
Well, it reflects to a certain extent political balls. The bigger the political balls, the more expansive the SAS involvement is going to be, and their ability to actually play right across the operational spectrum. In previous generations of that 50 years of their existence, the political balls have been quite small, and therefore the utility of SAS, or the willingness to employ SAS in areas they could have employed, has been narrow. I'd say to you that in the last 10 years or so, and this is again a result of 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan and so forth, that our political masters are far more inclined to take risks and so forth because they become more practiced at it. We live in a world now where they've got to, you know.